Hello, hello, hello. There, it's working. Hey, everybody. How are we doing? It's good to see everybody. Last session here, okay. So, is there anything we can pray about tonight? Let's pray. Father, we praise you. You are the incredible, awesome creator of the universe. You made everything with a purpose. Your plan is incredible. Forgive us for when we go against your plan. And help us to understand. We know that you have instilled within creation itself, within ourselves, with a conscience, and especially in your word, what is right and what is wrong and how we're to live in this world. So I ask that you would teach us, especially these difficult topics, these last topics we're going to discuss. So lead us, Lord. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I have 4 major topics that I want to cover tonight. And I have to leave a bunch of stuff out. But we already knew that, okay? Because we knew that this was going to be a condensed version. And so we're going to look at 4 topics, but hopefully we can cover all 4. So I might have to do this at a little more rapid pace. We may not even be able to do any breakout sessions tonight, if that's okay. So yeah, we'll give you your break. I will give you your break. Yeah, so that's very, very important. Okay, so first issue that we want to talk about is transgenderism. And I mentioned that even this morning in my message. Also called gender dysphoria. Transgender refers to people who believe their gender identity does not correspond to their biological sex. That's the Gospel Coalition definition. So what are we supposed to think about? This has really become a major issue within our day. Interestingly enough, that our country is dividing over the question of whether a biological male can be a woman or not, and vice versa. So that's where we're at. So we want to take a look at this. There's issues with sports now coming up, with bathrooms and gyms, etc. So I want to read I want to start out. There's a book, if I can find it here. I got all my books in the wrong order, wouldn't you know it? Okay. There's a book called The 4 Views, Understanding Transgender Identities, 4 views on this. And it starts out with just some underlining points that I'd like to kind of read some of the highlights here, okay? So, let's see here. It was December 1st, 1952, when the Daily News in New York City ran a front page story with a headline, "Ex-GI becomes blonde beauty." And with that, Christine Jorgensen was introduced to America. Transgender histories within the U.S. context commonly begin with Jorgensen, the first American to become widely known for having a procedure referred to at the time as a sex change, but more commonly known today as sex reassignment surgery, SRS. Gender reassignment surgery, gender confirmation surgery, or gender affirming surgery. I think that's the most recent one. Jorgensen's surgery was performed in Denmark, and upon returning to the U.S., she became an instant celebrity. She went on to work as an actor and entertainer and became an early transgender advocate. So just a little history here. The germ of this idea can be traced back to Charles Darwin, this idea of non-binary, who set the stage for a new genderless human nature. And it can be found running through the thoughts of many of the early leading sexologists, including Sigmund Freud. This idea leads to the conclusion that the male and female sexes do not conform to a strict binary, it's two, but instead reflect something of a continuum. Within this intellectual atmosphere, the idea that a man could become a woman or vice versa seemed increasingly possible. These categories were originally formed by doctors and psychologists engaged with the treatment of intersex conditions. It wasn't long, however, before they were being used to explain transsexual persons as well. In this atmosphere, it was increasingly the case that the mind, the sense of self, was seen as less malleable than the body. Malleable meaning changeable, okay? So, because that really is, if a person, if they're biological male and they think or feel that they're a female, it's a case between the mind and the body, right? Okay, so that's the... and their argument is that the mind is less malleable, harder to change than the body, is what they're saying. During this period, transgender activism grew. The 1966 riot at the Compton Cafe in San Francisco, a response by drag queens and transvestites to police raids, has been deemed the first significant act of transgender-focused protest in America. The 1970s saw the formation of new transgender-related organizations. An important public figure at this time was Renee Richards, a trans woman who underwent a male-to-female transition in 1975. The next year, she was denied entrance to the Women's U.S. Open tennis tournament. Richards fought the decision, and in 1977, the New York Supreme Court ruled in her favor. The incident became a landmark moment for transgender rights. On the other hand, 1979 also marked a year in which Paul McHugh, the new director of the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, put an end to performing SRS, sex reassignment surgeries, at the very clinic where John Money had begun it all. So Johns Hopkins was the first place where they had a sex reassignment, and now they ended that. McHugh has gone on to become a leading voice among those warning that transitioning is not the best response to gender dysphoria. The year 1979 also saw the publication of Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, the most well-known feminist critique of transsexuality. So we see Johns Hopkins, they end doing those surgeries because they felt like it was not helping anyone from the research that they did, and it was destroying perfectly good tissue that wasn't actually helping anyone. So they backed off and stopped doing it. And then we have this movement within feminism reacting against it. Feminism is kind of, it's a mixed bag. Some, you have the lady who wrote the, what's all the books that everybody likes? Harry Potter. She's obviously a feminist, but opposed to transgenderism because of its anti-feminism. But others are in favor of it, so that's kind of a battle going on right now. But so we see that here. There's a broad agreement that the 1980s saw a significant conservative cultural adjustment to America. This cultural shift, which began in the late 70s and extended through the 80s, brought both a conservative political impulse, marked by the Reagan presidency, and the emergence of a number of new socially conservative, often explicitly Christian organizations, such as Focus on the Family, the National Federation for Decency, and the Moral Majority. The 1980s served as the immediate context for what James Davison Hunter identified as the culture wars. If you remember, in the 70s, you had the Jesus movement. That brought on a lot of people into the kingdom, and that ended up having an influence, even politically, in the 80s with Reagan being elected and then bringing that kind of sway backwards. I would argue that that's the chief way any change is going to take place. I'm not opposed to politics, but I think revival is absolutely essential. Okay. Then he goes on here. Queer theory. The moniker queer, originally a derogatory slur, came to be embraced by the gay and lesbian communities of the 90s as a term of pride, one that encompassed defiance, celebration, and refusal. Queer theory itself emerged from the confluence of several academic streams, including post-structuralist, deconstructionist, literary theory, feminist thought, and gay and lesbian studies. Don't worry, you don't have to remember all that. The work of Michael Foucault, especially his 3-volume The History of Sexuality, was highly influential. Early shapers of queer theory include Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick. Noreen Giffney captures the theoretical gist along with the philosophical aesthetic proclivities of queer theory. Here is her quote. Queer theory is an exercise in discourse analysis. Queer is all about excess, pushing the boundaries of the possible, showing up language and discursive categories more specifically for their inadequacies. There is an unremitting emphasis in queer theoretical work on fluidity, uber-inclusivity, indeterminacy, indefinability, unknowability, the preposterous, impossibility, unthinkability, unintelligibility, yes, meaning, that wasn't in there, meaninglessness, and that which is unrepresentable or incommunicable. The erotics of thinking, speaking, writing, listening, and reading is a chief concern. So with queer theory, they're seeking to say that there really is no gender. It's all fluid, moving from however many genders you want to come up with. Not every transgenderist embraces that. In this, it resonates with 20th century feminism's emphasis on the socially constructed nature of gender and gender differences, but it presses further to suggest that even the supposed sex differences associated with male and female are primarily a factor of sociolinguistic construction, a social construct that humans came up with the idea of gender, is what she's saying, not objective biological facts. To think otherwise is to fall victim to the, quote, phallocentric straitjacket of biological reductionism. A key idea within queer theory, one that resonates with the field of transgender studies, is that identity is fluid and malleable, and thus that gender is not an essence human beings possess, but rather a performance they engage in. Gender is understood as potentially porous and permeable spatial territories, arguably numbering more than 2, each capable of supporting rich and rapidly proliferating ecologies of embodied difference. So with queer theory, you can change, you can move, you're fluid in all of this stuff. Notice the difference between the homosexual agenda and queer theory. Homosexuals say, I was born this way. I can't change. Queer theory says, with gender, not sex, but not sexual preference, but gender, this is fluid. It can move back and forth. They really are at odds with one another, but they have to join together in order to have the numbers to be able to politically change things. I could see LGBTQ eventually breaking up their marriage. Okay, well, anyway, just to reiterate that. There we are. One last quote here. Alongside the growing cultural awareness and acceptance of the transgender community have come counter tendencies that serve to raise critical questions regarding transgender identity, particularly transsexuality. For example, the feminist critique that began in the 70s has continued within certain sectors of contemporary feminist thought, referred to as radical feminism or gender-critical feminism, or alternatively as trans-exclusionary radical feminism, or TERF, by its critics. This feminist perspective proposes that the presence of MTF, males to female transsexuals, can threaten natal women-only safe spaces, and poses just one more way in which men are able to co-opt and erase women. That makes sense, doesn't it? So that's a little introduction by in the Four Views book. Let me give you some arguments in favor of transgenderism and then some arguments against transgenderism, okay? First of all, well, we're way past this. Let me see. How did we, there we are. Whoops. We did this. And we did this. There we are. Arguments in favor of transgenderism. First of all, gender is not the same as sex. It is a social construct. So they see the sexual activity, but they say the gender is something that humans made to kind of just help us understand things for a while. But since we made it, we can change it. And so if somebody in the past they would say is trapped in a male body when they're actually female, that the gender is just, you know, someone else's thoughts on what I really am, but I really am a female, or etc. So it's not the same as sex. They would also point out intersex people, as was brought out, hermaphrodites, people who are born with both parts, and that really is, and most people would agree, a malady. It's not the way it's supposed to be. We're broken, and so some people are born with both parts. Interestingly, they are only born with either male or female chromosomes. So now it's almost doesn't really matter because you do have those chromosomes, but typically at birth or shortly thereafter, the parents make a decision which way to go, and that's, and so through surgeries, etc., that's how that's typically dealt with. So, but that idea is, okay, if we have this, then, a physical both, why can't we have it be a mental problem? Okay, so this is the argument that they would use. So they'll bring out the intersex people. They will also, this was interesting, eunuchs, they say, are not fully male or female. So whether they were eunuchs by choice, eunuchs by birth, eunuchs by later on, etc., others doing that, that they're not fully male or female, but I think the eunuchs would probably disagree with that. So it's not the greatest argument. But I'm just giving you all the arguments from the Four Views. The mind is more important and accurate than the body. This is probably their strongest belief, okay, that the mind is more important and accurate than the body. Now, this is quite fascinating. If you remember, I didn't bring her book, Nancy Pearcey, I mentioned her book before. Nancy Pearcey makes a case where she describes how things have completely flip-flopped since the 60s, 70s in the way we deal with things. There was some evidence in the past where theologians argued that the world kind of separated the physical and the spiritual realms. And they separated them to such a degree that they had a higher story and a lower story. And back then, the lower story, the physical realm, that's all that mattered. This realm up here, spiritual realm, you know, that's not as real as the physical realm, okay? So they created this two-story version of the world. Now, the Bible obviously speaks of us being both. We're both physical and spiritual, and both are equally true, okay? But this idea, Francis Schaeffer is the one who really brought that out. Well, Nancy Pearcey describes how that completely turned around. And now, though they still maintain the separation, but it's flip-flop. The spiritual or mental or mind is more real than the physical. The physical is not what's important, and that's why her book is called Love Thy Body, the body. She's arguing in several ways, by dealing with abortion, by dealing with transgenderism, homosexuality, etc., that these are they're placing the mind ahead of the body, that the body doesn't matter. See, if my body is male but my mind is female, that's what really matters. So it's quite interesting, almost a form of Gnosticism, where the spiritual or the mind is what's actually real as opposed to the physical. And so we see here these arguments in favor of transgenderism, just so that you can know this is how they're thinking, okay? Before I look at the arguments against it, was I clear? Any questions? Okay. All right. Let me move on then and look at the arguments against it. Why is it not? Okay, that's right. That's correct. That's correct. Okay. Arguments against transgenderism. First of all, I want to ask, what is real compassion? Okay, so this first part here is typically in early transgender as well as homosexual, there was a lot of bullying going on, and that is true. Okay, there's a lot of bullying going on, and some of that could be in the mind of the person getting bullied, because sometimes some people, in fact, I've had know people who've had conversations with people who said they were bullied, but in actuality, it was just somebody telling them they disagreed with them. Okay, that's not bullying. Just because you disagree and you're having a discussion, that's not bullying. But their feelings were hurt by this, so they define it as bullying. Now, in the past, though, there really was true bullying going on. So I don't want to lessen that, because they're really, it's wrong if what I was said was correct this morning, that we're supposed to treat every single human being with dignity, respect, etc. Bullying is always wrong, okay? But what is bullying, and then what is real compassion, okay? We do want to have compassion for these people, but if Christians are correct in that transgenderism is that the body is correct and the mind is incorrect if they're not in sync, then, and that's a product of being broken, so therefore transgenderism is not something to celebrate, it's something to recognize these people are struggling, okay? And if so, real compassion, we should want to help them. Now, advocating what they're doing is not helping them. Now, at the same time, beating them up, talking to them when they don't want to talk, you know, we can't make people listen to us, right? But offering a difference of opinion and so forth, I think that's important, and it goes a long ways. If your heart is right, listen, if your heart isn't right and you're just really mad at them, don't say anything. Get your heart right first. Love these people. And but recognize here, real compassion. We're all broken, right? We're all broken, and so hopefully we can feel for other people who are broken in different ways than we are. But recognize it's broken. If the mind and the body disagree, something's wrong. Something's out of whack. And if the body is actually fully functioning correctly, so we're not talking about the intersex people, but if the body is fully functioning correctly, then the mind is wrong. That would be the logical thing, and therefore compassion should be shown. So let me, secondly, let me give you some illogical inconsistencies of the LGBT movement, okay? You know, I ask, what about the spouse? Now think about this. Let's imagine a couple who get married that are homosexual, okay? So two people get married, they're homosexual, and one then becomes transgender. So let's say it's two females, they get married, and one of them becomes a male later, okay? Are they still homosexual? Well, they are in our mind, but are they in their mind? No, because it's a man and a woman, right? So, but what about the woman who was homosexual and was born that way and cannot change? That's a serious problem between these two groups, the LGB and the T. So what about the spouse? That's, I think, important for us to understand here, that there's really a logical inconsistency here. Secondly, transgender appears to be anti-feminist, as we've seen. Let me argue this one a little more. And so I want to ask, first of all, the women in this group here, okay? I want to ask you, can a man really know what it's like to be a woman? Anybody think yes? You're all saying not a chance, right? Okay. And I agree. We are so different that a man cannot know what it's like to be a woman. And by the way, it's vice versa. A woman simply does not understand what it's like to be a man. We have very, very different ways of thinking, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes to the biological elements as well, the cycle that you go through, all of those things, okay? So a man cannot understand what it's like to be a woman. So if a biological male thinks he's a woman, what is he even talking about? He doesn't know what it's like to be. He might think he does, but this is anti-feminist. He thinks he knows what it's like to be a woman when he couldn't even possibly know what it's like to be a woman. He's probably making the mistake of thinking that if one man is a little more effeminate than another man, that makes him a woman, but it doesn't at all. Men are different, even back in the biblical times. You have Jacob and Esau. Remember those two? Jacob and Esau. Jacob, his dad loved Esau better because Esau was the hunter, the manly man. He was the, they could go, rah, and Jacob actually got along with his mom a little better because he liked to cook and that kind of thing, okay? But Jacob was just as much a man as Esau was and ended up having the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? So that I would say is fluid, that idea of, a little more masculine, a little less masculine, etc. Some guys don't like hunting. Some guys don't, that's okay. That really is not what determines what is a man and what is a woman. But a man just because he's maybe a little more effeminate than another man, he still has no idea at all what it's like to be a woman. And so I think this is anti-feminist. The third one, transgender opens Pandora's box. We saw it a while back. Rachel Dolezal, the former president of the NAACP, who claimed to be black, because you have to be black to be a part of the NAACP, okay? And she was actually the president, and they found out she's not black, okay? But she said she identified as black. And the blacks rightfully said, you do not know at all what it's like to be African American, to have that history. And by the way, we're going to talk about racism, and I want every one of you who is white to recognize this. You have absolutely no idea what it's like to be African American. To have that history, to have that prejudice that does still go on. We can argue about how much, etc. But that's to have that, all of that in your family, in your history. For someone to come along and say, I identify as black, that's the problem we have here. People saying, well, I just feel like I'm this. Okay, so it seems to me that we're opening up all kinds of problems there, okay? So we have compassion, but what does that actually mean? We have the illogical inconsistencies, and then we have natural law. Remember, we brought that in. We can know some things through natural law. We'll get to the Bible in just a minute, but we can know some things through natural law. If the body and mind disagree, and the body, including the Y chromosome, is functioning properly, then more than likely the mind is at fault. A young person's identity swarmed by hormones. I used to teach 8th grade American history. And my heart goes out to 13 and 14-year-olds. You know, that is, those of you who have recently lived that, remember, yeah, that was a tough age, okay? And so they're fragile. They need guidance, not more options. To give them those options when some of the studies, I think we'll bring that out a little later. Some of the studies, let me mention one. There was a study that brought out that I believe it's 80% of those who struggle with their gender identity during their teens at 21 embrace the biological gender, you know, male or female, what they are. So, but if you change, if you do an operation, or you start taking, you know, the blockers, etc., you are dooming that person to a very, very difficult life. And by the way, transgenderism, another study, I believe it's 60% of transgender males, 55% of transgender females, no matter what they do, attempt suicide. That's huge. And some have argued, well, that's because of the bullying. But there's other groups, even homosexuals, who are bullied just as much. Many other groups as well, that have nowhere near that percent of attempted suicide. So it is something else besides just bullying that might contribute to it, but it's not the reason why. The reason is, in my opinion, is there's something seriously psychologically wrong, broken. And so we want to help. How can we help? What is the true compassion there? And that's what we see just from natural law and from the studies. Now, unfortunately, the studies are going to become skewed from now on simply because there's a political correctness that hinders just neutral studies. A classic example of that is a professor at the University of Texas. He studied the families of homosexual couples, and he wanted to see if they were as well, functional as other families. And so he did the study. This guy was not a Christian or anything. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just did the study, and he found that they had far less, as far as, the elements that he was looking for, as far as the kids graduating and this and that and all the other things, being a well, healthy family. And when he produced the results, University of Texas fired him. So who's going to continue doing anything at all that's going to show any kind of results that are going to go against this movement? Because, they don't want to get fired. I'll just do my studies on something else. Whereas the only people that are going to do it are the transgenders who might have a bias. And so that's the difficulty we have, but some of the results that we have right now we can see. The biblical witness, interestingly, 1 Corinthians 6 verse 9, which we addressed when we looked at it in the homosexual issue. In the actual Greek, it mentions two words. Typically, most translations just say homosexual. Okay, it actually mentions two words, and the first word is malakoi, which pretty much literally means soft. And most believe that back in those times, they believed that homosexual relations typically had one person who was a little more effeminate and one person who was a little more masculine. And so those two words correspond to that, a little more effeminate male and a little more masculine male. Now we know in the passage, this is, as I argued already, this has nothing to do with rape, homosexual rape, because both are condemned, okay, including the malakoi. It says they're not going to inherit the kingdom of God either. So it is a mutual consent homosexual relationship, but it's using that idea of the malakoi, the soft, is not a female, it's a male who's more effeminate. And so the biblical witness would argue that this is what we have, in fact, what's going on, not someone who's trapped in a male body but thinks they're a woman. Let's see. Gender is given by God. I argued that this morning, so we'll just, male and female, he gave them. That goes against that idea that it's a social construct, at least from the biblical witness. He says, no, it's God's idea. There are males and females. We see this reiterated in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 6, where Jesus quotes Genesis 1:27 and agrees with it, that there are male and female, two genders, and it corresponds to the biological sex. It is not a socially constructed concept like the new sexual theorists argue. Okay, I'm going to skip Mohler's because I'm already past my time. Okay, let's go. Transgender solutions. Gender is given by God. Transvesticism is prohibited. Now, it's important for us to see this here. Some will say, well, that's different than transgender. Yes, that is true, but understand what he's saying. Deuteronomy 22:5 specifically prohibits a man wearing women's clothing. So that's, and obviously in different cultures, that's going to be different. right? But in every culture, there are male and female dress, attire. What's really wrong, and the reason why this is a law, the principle behind this is that there does need to be a recognition of a difference between men and women. And so we see this in transvestism being prohibited. And transgender solutions are harmful. Let me read. Did I already read that? No, I didn't, right? Psychological theories. To begin, those who hold that psychological phenomena offer the best explanatory pathways for understanding transgender phenomena often point to the many studies that show a significantly higher degree of mental health problems among the trans population compared with the general populace. And then he lists all these different studies that have been done, peer-reviewed studies. Specifically, researchers have found that conditions including ADHD, autism, affective and anxiety disorders, depression, and schizophrenia occur at significantly higher than usual rates among transgender people. Those advocating a psychological approach to treatment as opposed to hormone and or surgery-based transitioning protocols can point to research showing that while SRS appears to alleviate mental health problems for some, for a sizable group of others, psychological morbidity is unaffected by or actually increases after surgical transitioning. And there's many of these studies that I could show as well. Okay, so transgender solutions are harmful. So there we have the cases for, cases against. It seems that the biblical witness is very clear, and it seems to me that if we're just arguing from a psychological perspective, rather than if we just set aside the emotional aspect of it, transgenderism is harmful, and we should try to help them. But it's certainly not true that a physical male can be. So the idea that men can have a period is, or have babies, is not true. Okay? Women have babies, men don't. Questions? Yes.
So I agree that transvestism is not, is considered a sin. But where would you see that in the New Testament? Just for sake of argument, when we talked about
Sure.
if it's in the Old Testament and
Right.
the New Testament, we could say that it's God's moral law.
And it would seem that it appears to the whole sexual content in general, which I think we can see from all of the other aspects of sexuality, are seen as moral issues, not any of the other three. So because of that, there seems to be this gender identity that God has instilled. So males should be and live like males, females, and this is just bringing out that. But it's not the only point. If that was all we had, it'd be a weak point. Yep. Okay.
Paul's letter doesn't he address dress for women?
Yeah, he does. Although I think you could argue outside of the modesty part would be very eternal, so to speak, for both men and women, I would argue. But some of the things that he brings out were cultural, so I don't think that would also that would be a strong argument either, because it is cultural that women should wear a head covering. Okay. Let's see if we got it. Oh, we got one here. There we go. Any others? I see a couple guys with head coverings. But So, yeah, it's more of a cultural thing, but a cultural thing that says something. Whenever something's cultural, that doesn't mean that you can throw it out. It simply means we want to find out what was the purpose behind the cultural thing. Okay, cultures might change, but what's the underlying principle that stays the same? And that is that men and women are different, and that there is a for women, there's a part of the role for being subject to the husband, etc. You know, so that's it would seem. Okay, ready to move on to the next category? All right, well, that's an important one, so it's okay. I do want to now switch gears. I want to talk about murder, killing, and racism, okay? Why is murder wrong?
Spiritual standpoint, you're determining, you're not giving them a chance to, if they're not a Christian, you're taking away their chance of possibly becoming one.
Okay, you're into that. Yeah. Some people use that argument against all war. I hope to get to war, not actually get to war, but to talk about war at the end here. That's my fourth category that we may get to or not. But okay, so yeah. Yeah, and that is a very good argument, argued in Genesis chapter 9. In fact, it states that if somebody kills somebody, murders somebody, let's say, sometimes there is a place for killing, war, capital punishment. That very verse actually says, then his life is forfeit. So you need to kill him if he murdered somebody, because that person murdered someone created in the image of God, and that is so important, so far more important than killing an animal, for instance, that it forfeits the person's right to life. So you're absolutely right. That's probably the biggest reason why murder is wrong. But interestingly, notice in that passage, therefore they forfeit their life, which means they should be killed. So there is a difference between killing and murder. There's a few different Hebrew words that are sometimes used. Almost all the time, the word used in the Ten Commandments for murder is a reference to outside of law, taking someone's life out of hatred and purposeful, so not accidental. Okay. The unlawful killing of another human being out of hatred and planned. That's what we typically call first-degree murder, I think, or something like that. Okay. Let's see here. I'm just going to skip some of this stuff here. Why is murder wrong? God commanded us not to. That's a pretty good reason, don't you think? Okay. We're supposed to take care of each other, so it's kind of the opposite. Taking care of each other. Murder is an attack on God's image, biggest one there. And murder is a culmination of uncontrolled anger, as Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 5. Okay. Now, I normally get you into groups, but we're not going to do that, okay? I want to talk about racism. And most people today, and I hope all Christians today, would agree that racism is wrong and is a sin. Is that fair? The difficulty is in defining racism, because there are two different definitions of racism. The common definition today being used is that racism is when, and they typically point out two classes of people. They actually get this from Marxism. Two classes of people. There's the oppressed and the oppressors. And racism is when the oppressors look down upon the oppressed as a group people, or race. Okay? Now notice that new definition. The oppressed can't commit racism. They can't commit racism. They're not racist. They can't be racist because they're the oppressed in that definition. Whereas before, it simply was anyone looking down upon a group or people or race as inferior to their own. Okay? And therefore, someone who is being oppressed in a particular race could look down upon the oppressors and be racist and say all of those, white people or whatever, are bad, okay? So in the earlier definitions, all people could commit this sin, but now the new definition, only the oppressors, and typically that's the majority population of whatever, wherever the place is. So we have a difficulty in defining it. But there's another question. I want to read this. I found this interesting, and I really appreciate this book. By the way, in dealing with this, I do confess that I don't know everything and that I cannot relate, okay? Certainly, I've had people say hateful things to me in the past. I remember one guy, I was preaching, and this was when we planted a church in Orlando, and this guy who was, I don't know, a little different, he came up to me afterwards, and we were outside, and there was others around, and he said, "The Lord told me to tell you that you're a jerk." Now, that hurt. You all are laughing, but that hurt me, okay? And I thought to myself, well, what did I do? The Lord told him to tell me that, okay? So I've experienced some pain, but I don't know what it's like to be a minority group and have a majority group treat me in an inferior manner. Okay, but I want to, so that's why I've read books from both sides, and a couple of the books that I really appreciated was this one here, this is my favorite one, by Benjamin Watson, called Under Our Skin. Now, Ben Watson, he was the tight end for the New Orleans Saints, and he was really good too. He's also a Christian, and he wrote this book on the issues of race, and he is actually questioning, is race a biblical or biological reality? Okay, so let's just see what he has to say. He states, he's quoting Ken Ham here. Ken Ham reports on the research regarding the biology of racial differences. The truth is that these so-called racial characteristics are only minor variations among people groups. If one were to take any two people anywhere in the world, scientists have found that the basic genetic differences between these two people would typically be around 0.2%. even if they came from the same people group. But these so-called racial characteristics that people think are major differences, skin color, eye shape, etc., account for only 0.012% of human biological variation. Anthropologist Ashley Montagu's classic book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race, says the idea of race represents one of the most dangerous myths of our time and one of the most tragic. Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project for a decade and a half, an outspoken Christian and best-selling author of The Language of God, has said that all human DNA is 99.9% identical. While that remaining 0.1% is being deeply researched, it too reveals that such differences are not racial in origin. Geneticist Dwayne Fulwiley says there is no genetic basis for race. Your physical traits and mine have more to do with our ancestors adapting to the geography and cultures of a place than with the genetics of a race. According to these scientists, as an African American, I am far more genetically similar to many of my Caucasian friends than they are to certain other Caucasians. Race is literally only skin deep. We are commonly human. Of course, race does exist, but science proclaims it to be far more of a social understanding than a scientific one. So that's interesting. So there is something to race, but it is a social rather than scientific, is what he is suggesting. So what are some of the racial divides of the past? Okay, not really race, though. Okay, it's based on religious beliefs. In fact, they were all the same race. Okay. All right, but what? Yes.
Okay, so I grew up in Pontiac, Michigan until I was 15, and so school-wise, we were separated from the white people, we were separated from the black people.
So the one you're bringing out is the racial divide that began with African slavery and what we see today between African Americans and Caucasian Americans. Okay, yep, that's probably the biggest one before us right now, right? Okay, that's in fact African slavery finally ended officially, fully on June 19th, which is Juneteenth, almost 250 years of slavery. And that's 250 years. And it was brutal slavery. It was not like some of the other slaveries that have been in the past. It was really, really bad. Okay, so that's definitely one. But are there others? Okay, not just in Egypt. Why don't we just put anti-Semitism that began in Egypt? They were slaves how long? Okay, 400 years. That's more than 250, isn't it? And they weren't treated very nicely. Would you agree? But not only that, throughout the centuries, up to this present day, there is anti-Semitism. They do censuses every year at hatred crimes. And the number one group that experiences hate crimes every year is the Jews. That's the way it is. Believe it or not, Christians are the number two group, and Islam, Muslims, are the third group. Yes? Asians? Asians are becoming a hate group?
Well, they're not becoming the hate group.
They're becoming hated. Okay, okay, so maybe something new. Okay. But our past, okay, what else? What else? We're missing some. Okay, Native Americans have experienced, the Trail of Tears, etc. Okay, they've experienced some seriously terrible things in them. Yeah, yeah.
Kind of what she was bringing up, but actually the Chinese have been subject to racism in the United States for a long time. Back in the 1800s and 1900s when they came over, they were segregated and also put in menial positions because of their race.
Okay, sure, yeah. Japanese internments, remember World War II? Japanese Americans. Okay, so these are not foreigners, these are Japanese Americans. They were American just as much as German Americans. And well, as far as the war, who started World War II? Germany. So why didn't we have German American internment camps where we took away their land and their homes and forced them to live in barbed wire places? Why didn't we? It's because they look like us. That's why. There's no other reason for it. Japan attacked us, but Germany was the original hater there. You know, if we're worried about the war, they said we had to keep them because they might turn on us. No, the Germans would turn on us just as much as the Japanese, because these are Americans, not people that are over here visiting, okay, or just working. These were Americans they put in. So we don't need to justify it. Let's say this was absolute racism. It was sin. It was evil. The Irish influx, because of the potato famine, people hated the Irish. They were mean to the Irish when they first came over. That's just the way it was. It was racism. Okay? Vietnamese, yeah. Okay. Now, what's interesting about all these groups is their reaction to the hatred. If you looked at the Irish, or if you look at the Jews specifically, and even the Japanese, their reaction to the hatred was work hard, seek to earn the right to be looked upon as an equal, and they ended up being seen as equals. Except for the Jews, they still, for whatever reason, continue to have that anti-Semitic stance, but they never play the victim card. That's huge in this whole issue. When we play the victim card, and that's another African American, Anthony Bradley, wrote Liberating Black Theology. This is maybe a little over most people's head because he's dialoguing with James Cone, a black theology of liberation. This is where the idea of victimology came from. Most people haven't heard of James Cone, but he absolutely influenced African American thought to embrace this idea of being victims, and then this class where, and he was a Marxist, this idea of having these the oppressed and the oppressor, etc. Anthony Bradley argues that has hurt the African American attempt to overcome racism. Okay, so what's the right way and what's the wrong way? Hopefully we see that racism is wrong, and we want to make sure none of us have anything to do with it, and repent any time we start even thinking that one race is superior to another, because it literally is skin deep. You know, when Hitler thought that certain groups were just, you know, because of evolution, should be selected out, he was just wrong. When Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, she did it and put the Planned Parenthoods in the inner cities because she wanted to eliminate the black race. She saw them as inferior, did not want them to be reproducing, and so she came up with Planned Parenthood. I'm dumbfounded that Planned Parenthood doesn't absolutely back away from that woman. What an evil person who embraced evolution and was wrong. It's imagine if the Planned Parenthoods would not have been put in the inner cities, and if the African Americans were able to have, you know, would have had all those babies instead of killing them. Just imagine the geniuses we missed out on because of that evil. So we dare not embrace any form of racism. I want to look at biblical justice, I like to also talk about slavery and slavery in the Bible, because that's an issue today. How come the Bible sanctions slavery? I don't have time for that, but I have written a paper on it. I think it's on the website, okay? So slavery in the Bible should give you some really good information about that, okay? But I want to bring out 3 things for biblical justice. By the way, racism. Any questions on that? Any thoughts?
In a subtle way, is evolution a proponent of racism by saying that certain humans are farther advanced than other humans?
It's not subtle. It's a part of their belief. It's a part of their understanding. Yeah, no, they would argue that certain people groups, yeah, that those are inferior to other people groups, and if we keep mixing the gene pool, we're going to this was what Hitler tried to do, get rid of the inferior gene pool. Now, he actually didn't think Jews were inferior. He saw them as a danger, and that's why he tried to kill them. He saw the Slavics as inferior, which in my opinion was his biggest mistake. Because Russia wanted to join him. And if he didn't have this Slavic prejudice, they would have taken over Europe. But he saw them as inferior, so he started a war, and then he has a 2-front war. And it's like, that was really dumb. So his racism ended up killing him, literally. Well, at any rate, okay. Other questions? Thoughts? And I typically in my classes, when we do debates, we often would have a debate as far as, is there still racism in the police force, and is it what's the word? The systemic racism in the police force. And I like those debates because they both have good points. So I know probably most of you are absolutely solid on, and because we support the police and everything, and the police we know do not do that. But there is at least some racism within the police force, and we certainly could do better and should seek to do that. How much it's okay for us to debate. And with respect, that's what I would suggest. But racism is not dead. Let's just say that, all right? People still, if they're African American, have to be a little more afraid when they see police than white people, and that's not fair because they didn't do anything. Okay, all right. Okay, let me give you 3 points on biblical justice so that we can then get to abortion. We're not going to have abortions. We're just going to talk about it, okay? So I always got to explain myself with my language. Okay, biblical justice. First of all, this is interesting. Innocent until proven guilty. This idea came directly from Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, which states that unless there are 2 or 3 witnesses, so you couldn't even convict somebody if there was just 1 witness. And the principle behind it is we need to make sure the best we have with all of our resources. Today we have DNA sampling and all that. We have CSI and all those guys, So we're much better at it. But even back in the biblical times, they wanted to do the best they could to make sure an innocent person wasn't condemned as guilty. So they had this and so therefore the principle was not that you were innocent, because somebody could get away with murder, couldn't they? In fact, a lot of people have. But in the court of law, the concept you are innocent until you're proven guilty, at least treated as innocent until proven guilty, that's right from the Bible. So our American jurisprudence actually stems from British jurisprudence, which came from the Bible. Okay, this concept, innocent until proven guilty. This is very, very important. This is a biblical justice understanding. Sometimes we call this social justice, right? And some people don't like that term. I personally don't mind it at all. I mean, because it is social justice. We're caring about social, people, relationships, and so forth. But some people say that social justice is only one view, and I disagree. I don't say, no, it isn't. But for the sake of argument, let's just go with biblical justice. What does the Bible say? And this is the first point: innocent until proven guilty. We saw this major point in when we had Kavanaugh being brought in as the Supreme Court justice, and a woman claimed that he raped her some 20 or 30 years prior, and so there was the case, well, then we shouldn't make him a Supreme Court justice because she accused him. In other words, guilty until proven innocent. And now, if he did it, that's despicable, isn't it? The problem in our world is we're not perfect. We don't have eyes on everything. And so there are going to be people who get away with things. But the Bible apparently feels like that we still have to have this mandate. You can't just have, just because someone says something, that means it's true. And that's how I'm understanding Deuteronomy 19:15. So innocent until proven guilty. I think, boy, if we abandon this, anybody can say anything about anyone. And that's secondly, blind justice. Now this is interesting. I do want somebody to read this verse. If somebody could volunteer to read Leviticus 19:15. Who's got their Bible? Nobody has their Bible? Looks like Nina has her Bible. Leviticus 19:15. Not be partial to the poor or the great. Interesting translation. Typically the rich or the, whatever. So you're not supposed to be partial at all. Doesn't matter. You don't treat the poor or the rich better than the others. In other words, blind justice. You do not see the person as the person, depending on their race or their financial status or whatever. No, you go by the facts, and that's it. You can't do that. So this is this concept of blind justice, which becomes very, very important once again in our jurisprudence. By the way, I would argue personally, and I know nobody's ever even brought this up, so I'm sure I must be a minority understanding with this issue. But our system today with lawyers is not fair. Poor people don't get the same representation as rich people, and that's not right. And I know the only solution I can think of is that if everybody gets the right to the same group of lawyers, and that is not a capitalist understanding in that particular issue. But I think if you want blind justice, everybody should have the same rights. Classic example of this is O.J. Simpson. That guy literally got away with murder. I mean, they had the DNA, but he had a good lawyer. A really good lawyer. and maybe I'm stepping on somebody's toes who watched all the films and said, no, no, I really do think he's innocent. You know, you don't have to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. That's how we understand these things. And it sure seemed to me that he got away with murder because he was rich. And that's not right. Whereas, and by the way, this is an argument against capital punishment, is that not necessarily that it's not in the Bible, but that right now it's unfair to poor people, specifically and especially poor black males. It's way too high of a percent that's who end up getting killed for the same crimes that whites get off, much easier. And that's not right. The same crime should have the same penalty. That's my thoughts. And so how do you fix this? Well, I think you fix it by fixing the entire system. But like I said, has anybody even brought that up? I don't hear anybody bringing that up. And maybe I'm just missing something. That's highly possible. Okay. But I do believe blind justice is critical, and we need to see that. And it is, at least has supposed to be a part of our jurisprudence. And then a trial is necessary. This is Jesus mentioning this. John 7:51, he actually mentions this, that you're supposed to have a trial before you're proven guilty. So you're not guilty and then proven innocent. You're innocent and then you have a trial. And this is because, and I like this proverb, Proverbs 18, verse 17 and verse 13, that somebody appears right until somebody else brings an alternate thought. Have you ever really thought something was true and then someone else comes along and they say something and you're like, oh, wow, that's a good point, and changed your mind? Does that ever happen to anybody? Okay. Oh, man, yeah. You find out it's not true, yes. But I always thought if it was on the internet, it had to be true. Okay. Okay. But a trial necessary. Okay. Wow, you guys didn't ask for your break. Oh, okay. Break time. Break time, and then we're going to come back and talk about abortion. Okay, let's come on back. One of the things that I didn't share, and for whatever reason, it's almost like it's in the wrong section in my notes here for some weird reason. So I want to briefly take a look at this. Solving the problem. Do I have a? Yeah, let me see. Solving the race problem. There have been some solutions that have been given, and some are better than others, and that's the thing I suppose we need to deal with. I'm glad that at least we're trying to solve the problem. Okay, so that's a legitimate point. But I want to bring out some of the solutions, some that are better than others. The first one is violence. And this was Malcolm X. He came out of this. He was very different in his understanding than Martin Luther King Jr. in saying, in promoting violence in order to disrupt. This is in order to eventually bring about change. So you add an advocacy of violence in order to bring about change. Once again with Watson in his book. And I could read Cone, and James Cone did advocate violence, so I don't want to, but let me see if I want to. He's just bringing up the case with the Watts riots in Los Angeles and how that ended up really hurting the cause, because the white people just saw these people destroying their own neighborhoods and said that they're crazy, you know. So it didn't help their cause. And so I think we could make I know we could make a biblical case against violence as being the solution to solving the race problem. The opposite of that was the nonviolent protest that Martin Luther King Jr. advocated, which in my opinion was very, very good, and it really did bring about some of the some major parts of change. Martin Luther King Jr., you know, his "I Have a Dream" was just a beautiful, beautiful statement that, I mean, it's one of those classic, you know, voices that, you know, very, very few come along like that. You know, that I have a dream where black kids and white kids can play together, and a person is not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, that idea is being rejected by many now. It's not judged by the the conduct of their character. It's unfortunately that his voice is getting erased. Martin Luther King, let me see, Watson, he states here, oh yeah, I already did that. No? Watson also, let me see here. He's got one quote I know I really want to get to. I better not do that. He talks about his dad, but great point there. So nonviolent protests, and rather than feeling sorry for yourself and playing the victim, no, let's just show our strength here, and it really did make a difference. That's unfortunately, I think the Watts riots that kind of backtrack. That came from Malcolm X and his advocating. Another solution is politics. And the different groups, both Democrats and Republicans, have different thoughts on what would politically help this situation. I am glad that the two groups are trying to solve the problem. Their solutions, we can disagree as to which ones work better or work worse, and that should come with dialogue rather than, you know, just shouting at each other. But the idea that, you know, okay, can there be something done politically to help the cause? Okay, I'm not going to get into the politics of this, but that politics can be used to help in some way. What's the best way to do it? That's worth arguing about, okay? Or discussing, I should say, okay? And, but in all of these, I think the most important is the gospel. And this is what I like. This is the quote I want to read from Watson's book. It's actually in the introduction of his book. And let me read this. He says, I'm encouraged because ultimately the problem is not a skin problem, it's a sin problem. Sin is the reason we rebel against authority. Sin is the reason we abuse our authority. Sin is the reason we are racist, prejudiced, and lie to cover for our own. Sin is the reason we riot, loot, and burn. But I'm encouraged because God has provided a solution for sin through his Son, Jesus, and with it a transformed heart and mind, one that's capable of looking past the outward and seeing what's truly important in every human being. The cure for the Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and Eric Garner tragedies is not education or exposure, it's the gospel. So finally, I'm encouraged because the gospel gives mankind hope, and I like that. I agree. But I would also say we should have empathy on both sides of the argument for what might be the best way to... And we're never going to solve the race problem, not in this world because it's too broken and sinful hearts, etc. But can't we get better? I sure hope so. Okay, so dialogue, that's a good one. All right. Can we get to abortion? Let's talk about abortion, okay? Because I got a half hour to hit abortion and war. Probably not going to happen. Abortion. Let's see. The biblical argument. What does the Bible say? The unborn is a human being. We see that in Psalm 139. We see that in Luke chapter 144. The unborn is a human being. There's many other passages that we could look at as well. But the unborn is a human being. Secondly, there is a hierarchy of laws and rights. In other words, murder is more serious than inconvenience. So, yes, a woman has a right to her own body. No question about that. But not if it means murdering another human being. That's because murder is more serious than the inconvenience of having to carry a child, okay, for 9 months or whatever. So, not to belittle that point, we want, once again, in all of this, always show empathy. A woman who gets pregnant and doesn't know what to do and is in a very, very difficult situation does not need to get beat up. But at the same time, to offer abortion as one of the options is horrible. Okay, now as a professor, I'm supposed to give all the different reviews and this and that, but I don't care. This is awful, okay? Abortion's bad. Okay, but there is a hierarchy of laws. Murder is more serious than inconvenience. Then there's a natural law argument from science. What do we know about the scientific perspective?
Life begins at conception.
Do we? Well, okay, something's alive at conception, right? Okay, I don't know from natural law we could say from conception it's a full human being.
The cell starts dividing, right?
Yeah, but once again, it's not a human being yet. From biblical, I would say yes. Okay, but from a natural law perspective, it's potentially going to be a human being, you know, depending on how you define what is a human being. Okay, there's living things, yes, but that doesn't make it a human being. And it's going to become a human being. You know, y'all, I believe from a biblical standpoint, life begins at its conception, and it is a human being from the very beginning. But try to relate to people who don't believe the Bible, okay, they're not going to buy your arguments, okay? They're going to say it's a sell. Yes?
Most people don't know they're pregnant at 2 weeks.
Okay, and what happens at 3 weeks? This is what the answers I'm actually asking for. Huh? The baby has a heartbeat. Now, that's a pretty significant point, okay? Before anybody even knows they're pregnant, the baby has a heartbeat. Now, how do we determine if somebody's dead? The heartbeat's gone. The breathing's gone for a significant period of time. No brain waves, right? So if the heart's beating, that's a pretty good indication. And by the way, it looks like a human being, only really, really small. Okay? Have you ever read that wonderful Dr. Seuss book, Horton Hears a Who? It doesn't matter how small you are, right? Isn't that true? Okay, that's true. We're arguing about how big the person is. If it has a heartbeat, he or she is a he or a she, not an it. Okay, so these are the things. 18 days, heartbeat. 43 days, detectable brain waves. That doesn't mean they're not there before that. It's just we can detect brain waves at 43 days. And the 9 weeks, fingerprints, sexual organs, and functioning kidneys. Kidneys are very important. Okay. 12 weeks, all organs functioning, and the baby can cry. The fetus looks like a human being. I love, Ronald Reagan actually wrote a little book against abortion back in the 80s. And one of the points he makes is that if you're going to side on you're not sure or not if it's a human being, alive, etc., you side with the side that it potentially is a human being as opposed to not. Because, for instance, let's say you come to a crime scene. Not crime scene, an automobile accident, okay? And somebody appears, you're not sure if they're alive or dead, okay? You should, don't you think, assume they're alive until proven dead? Right? Isn't that fair? Okay, so if there's a discrepancy here and we have all these facts here from natural law, why wouldn't we say this is a human being? Which is fascinating. It reminds me of a joke. Better not. Okay, so, and since the fetus is a person, he or she has the same rights as the mother. Now, believe it or not, if you look at Roe versus Wade and you look at the actual writing of what they decided, they did not say that abortion was okay because it wasn't a human being. They said it wasn't a person yet. Roe versus Wade, and then later on, now most people don't know that, so most people argue, well, it is a human being, or no, it's just a fetus, whatever. No, the original argument was it wasn't a person. In other words, they separated the difference between a human being and a person. Now, the huge problem with that is, then how do you define a person? And typically when they define a person, turns out you can kill a 2-year-old with that definition. This is the serious, it angers me with all of the political system, Republicans and Democrats. Democrats because they promote abortion, but the Republicans just won't voice it. They won't say in an extended argument, here are the arguments for it being a human being. And that a human being is a person is a human being. There's no difference here. And so therefore, if that's true, then we do have this interesting statement from our Constitution. All men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But it is in that order. Life first, liberty second, pursuit of happiness third. if somebody's pursuit of happiness goes against someone else's life, like for instance, let's say I really just like murdering people, you know, it's what brings me happiness. Why can't I murder people? Well, because it's just going against their life, which is more important than your pursuit of happiness. Agreed? How is that different from abortion? Pursuit of happiness is not as important as life. And we cannot, I don't understand why. There was one time, who was it? It was a vice president got into a debate, and he actually said a couple things, but it's like, oh man, you could have said so much more. But they just are silent on this issue. Oh, anyway, okay. So, biblical argument, natural law argument. Let me give you some objections. Let me see here. Oh, there's my natural law. Sorry, the baby has all the signs of being human. Since the fetus is a person, he or she has the same rights as the mother. So this is both. Now, by the way, as Christians, we believe in the biblical argument, right? But as unbelievers in our country, we're not probably going to go very far arguing the biblical argument, but we can argue the natural law argument in order to persuade everybody in this way, okay? And this is typically what the states that are now making these anti-abortion laws. If you've noticed, most of them are something like heartbeat laws, et cetera, because they're recognizing this. We want to advocate now, as Christians, we would say, is from conception, and therefore, by the way, you know, people say, well, what about the case of rape? It still wasn't the baby's fault. You know, yeah, in fact, personally, I like the Old Testament law on that one. If a man rapes a woman, you kill him. You don't give him 2 years in prison. You kill him, okay? That seems reasonable to me. I think it would shrink the rape numbers. So I don't understand this. This is horrible. But it certainly doesn't mean, okay, he raped me, so I'm going to kill a person. That's not an argument. It doesn't make, you know. Anyway, that's my opinion there. Okay. Okay, objections. Typically, the objections, a woman has the right to her own body. We've discussed that. That, yes, of course, but with the hierarchy of laws, this doesn't apply to abortion. If abortion is illegal, women will use illegal means. We still hear that today, right? They'll go back to the coat hanger days. You know? So, okay, then let's allow murder. Because people are going to still murder, aren't they? So if they're going to still murder in illegal ways, we just need to allow them to murder in legal ways, right? No, that's crazy. That's, you know, that argument is not a very good argument. Okay, just to say, okay. Men shouldn't speak on abortion because it's a woman's issue. I think it's a human issue. Half the people getting killed are men. That's, you know, there's 2 people that are involved in the whole thing. So that one there is silly. I speak out against racism, and I'm not black. I think I should still be able to speak out against racism, though I fully understand I don't know what it's like. So women certainly have more empathy towards this issue, okay? But I would hope that men and women would both see the truths that we're seeing here. Okay, that's the basic arguments that I've seen. How should a Christian respond? Love those who have committed abortion. Okay, that's It's not the unpardonable sin. It is tragic. We definitely, I think we should do whatever we can to try to end it, but at the same time, love those who have committed abortion. The statistics are 1 in 4 women have committed an abortion, have had an abortion, which means in any particular group of people, at least 1 in 4 of them have done that. And so we want to show them compassion, not beat them up. At the same time, that doesn't mean advocate it. Okay? So love those who have committed abortion, provide alternatives, which I think we have done a very good job of this with the PRCs and other organizations. And I would say vote and teach awareness. If I'm correct in the hierarchy that murder is worse than these other issues, and if abortion is murder, which I think I've presented a fairly decent case that in fact it is murder, then I can't see any other issue more important. Now, granted, I'm not involved in some of the other issues that other people experience, and I'm not saying that the other issues don't matter. I'm just saying the most important issue would be that there's almost a million kids getting killed every year in this country. It's gone down a little bit, and that's good, but that is the worst genocide ever happening right now with abortion. The worst genocide ever. Just in our country alone, almost 1 million people getting silenced who don't have a voice and are taken out. I don't understand how any other issue is more important than that one. I mean, if every single other part of the issue, if my finances were going to get hurt and all kinds of other terrible things would take place, even if you had one group saying, we want transgenderism, we want to take all the money from the rich and give it to the poor, and we want to do this and this and this, but we also want to stop abortion. I think abortion is the most important thing, okay? I did not say I agree with those other things. I'm just saying that's, to me, is the most important issue. It's simply because of the numbers of people. We're going to look back at this and realize that the world has become more barbaric than ever before. It's just a clean barbarism. Questions? Yes.
So, like, Madison brought this to my attention, just 18 years. But in school, like, even the natural law, like, the way we look at it, still wouldn't get enough argument because she was in school. They're taught that an unborn isn't any more than a parasite, and it's like and it's so frustrating because how do you?
Well, once again, you need to just start explaining that's not even what Roe versus Wade argued.
Right.
Roe versus Wade did not argue that it wasn't a human being. They recognized it was, and now that we have so much more information since Roe versus Wade, we know even more so from the science. Go by the science. That's what I would tell them. Okay? The scientific method really is not our enemy. That's, well, when if people don't want to listen, there's nothing you can do. We can't force our beliefs on people. But if we can find people willing to at least discuss it one at a time, we can help them see that, it's a human being. And a human being is a person. Okay, do you have?
I just want to make a comment. Not all men are affected.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's why I think it should be a human issue, not just a female issue. Yeah.
Just another comment. It seems today like people have more compassion for animals by far than human beings.
And that is because of the move away from a biblical worldview. When you move away from a biblical worldview, you don't see human beings as unique, created in the image of God. So when you take that equation out, then, well, yeah, the llama is, has just as much rights as I do, etc. So yeah, so they, let's save the whales or whatever, because, I like whales. I think we should save the whales, but they're not as important as humans. So you're right. It's because the biblical worldview we've moved away from that. We're a post-Christian nation. I think we all know that. Yeah. All right. Briefly, let me skip past. No biomedical issues that we get to talk about. When I teach this, usually at least half of my students are nursing students, and they have to take ethics. So I include a healthy, by the way, if you're interested, especially in this last one, Humans 2.0, great book. Okay, talking about this transhumanism, where we're moving on to the next evolution. It is written by Christians, showing the difficulties of transhumanism. So, but Humans 2.0 by Fazal Rana. He calls himself Fuzz, but Fazal Rana and Kenneth Samples. Yeah, good book. Fairly detailed. Let's see here, euthanasia. We're going to get rid of that one. I just want it. There's your animal rights. Okay. See them all protesting. War. I want to briefly share the different views on war, okay? And see, so just to finish up with this, always, except today, begin with the wonderful, wonderful, fantastic song. War. War. Huh. Tell me what it's good for. Absolutely nothing. Come on, give it to me. War. I love that song. Starman, he was awesome. Great song. Whether you agree with him or not on his points, that was a great song. So I always start. So I even started this one with me singing. I typically have him doing it. Okay. There are three major views on war. There's activism, pacifism, and the just war theory. Okay. Activism. This is the idea that war is always correct if your country goes to war. Okay. So, for instance, if you join the military, and the military says we're going to Afghanistan, whether you agree with the war in Afghanistan or not, it is acceptable because your country is waging war. Okay, so, and their biblical argument, they typically will say the government is ordained of God, using some of these verses. They would say that we are to be subject to our government, several verses there. And then they would, some would give some philosophical arguments. These come from Socrates, or Socrates, as he's also known.
So what the second point up there, we are subject to our government, was that the argument against that would be when we were talking about lying versus, lying to save a Jew back in Nazi Germany.
Sure.
There's a higher law.
We're not always subject to our government. Absolutely. For instance, when in the Nuremberg trials, the SS soldiers that just did what they were told to do said that, and they still got penalized. Some were killed and others were, life imprisonment, even though they were in their 80s, but because they should have known better. So yeah, I don't agree with this view, but I'm giving you the points. Okay. Yes.
How about in the biblical days when they had to wipe out whole nations, whole groups?
You mean when they went in to take the land? They were only told that God was passing judgment on those people, the Canaanites, and they were told to take the land from Canaan, and they were not allowed to take any other land. In fact, they were told they can't go to war against anyone else unless they're attacked by them. So, yeah.
But they took out whole people groups according to God's
Yes,
command.
they slaughtered the Canaanites by God's command.
So that's war.
Well, yeah,
Okay, so I'm just
there's 3 views,
okay. I'm just
not just 2.
okay. Yeah.
Okay, wait till we get to the 3rd view. You see, but the first view is that war is always right. Okay, if your government sanctions it. They say the government is the human parent and educator. This is what Socrates said. I don't see that anywhere in the Bible. The government has a duty to, the governed have a duty to obey the government. True. The governed are free to leave their government. Sort of true, especially back then when Socrates was saying this. It's like, it might be a little difficult. Without government, there would be social chaos. And this is true. And this is a point where even if it's a bad government, chaos is worse than a bad government. That may be debatable. Okay? I'm just giving you their arguments. That's the philosophical. So they have a biblical and a philosophical argument for activism, which is the view that war is always right if the government wages war against someone else. Okay? Pacifism, which is the opposite. This is the view that war is never right, that we should never participate in war. And they usually use Jesus' example, 1 Peter 2:21, and chapter 4 as well, where Jesus allowed himself to be crucified rather than retaliation. And they would say, from this, we should ask, what would Jesus do? Could you imagine Jesus going to war and shooting people? Well, actually, when we see the 3rd case, yes, I could imagine that, absolutely, because he's going to do that. He has a sword in his mouth when he comes back, right? And slaughters the people at war, right? Okay, so, yeah, okay, that's a good question to ask, but this is the pacifist understanding. Jesus commands. They would say, that you should turn the other cheek, okay? To kill someone has eternal consequences. This is certainly true, right? If you kill somebody in war, you are either killing your brother or sister in Christ, or you're sentencing someone to hell, right? So that is serious, and that's one of their statements. We are to be separate from the world. So they're arguing we shouldn't be a part of the world's weapons and the world's ways of doing things, okay? And humans are not our enemies. Satan is. And so from these, some good points on pacifism, okay? Christians can be pacifists. We can agree to disagree agreeably on this issue because there are some good points on this. And martyrdom is actually a witness. That's what martyrdom means. Martyr is witness in the Greek. That's what it means, okay? I'm going to skip this one. We're going to look at the last one, the just war theory. Augustine, I believe, was the originator of this view, and others since then, Norman Geisler and others have advocated this, the just war theory. This is that some wars are acceptable to be involved in by Christians and other wars are not, depending on whether it is a just war. In other words, in Germany, if Hitler said, let's go kill all these people, you should say no. That was not a just war on his part. Okay, but there are some reasons why we should be, and other times we should say no. Okay, first of all, war in the Old Testament was commanded by God. So not all war can be wrong, because that would mean God was wrong, right? Is that fair? Okay. Actions of Jesus, yeah, he did turn the other cheek, but he also overthrew some tables, and he's coming back with a sword in his mouth, and he's going to kill people. Okay, that's the way it is. I know we don't usually see Jesus like that, but that's because we don't read the whole Bible. Okay. Statements of Jesus and the New Testament. So if you look at some of these verses on Jesus' statements, as well as other passages of the New Testament, we can see this thought. And then force is not violence. In other words, if the just war is just, it's not violence, it is pursuing a right cause, as we'll see it. And that's we're going to have to get to what makes a just war, okay? So, but first...
So you're saying it's more like it's contained. It has a set goal.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go past it.
One of the points for what makes a just war is it has to be a just cause. And so therefore it's in those instances, then it's not violence, it's protection, etc. Okay, so here's your criteria for a just war. You got to have a just cause, a good reason for war. If another country is attacking you, when Russia attacked Ukraine, they had a just cause to retaliate and fight back, because they're getting attacked. So it's self-defense. Self-defense is advocated in the Bible on a personal level as well as on a national level. Okay? If this is within pacifism, some are pacifists personally as well, like the Amish. If you walked up and started beating up somebody's wife, he would not stop you. And that's wrong, okay, guys? That's wrong. You protect your wives, period. Okay. So have a just cause, but you have to have a just cause. What's a just cause? And that's the questions, Typically I'll walk through some of the wars the United States have been in, and I'll say, okay, which ones fit all these categories? And there's room for disagreement on there. So here's the just cause. Defense, to stop oppressors. For instance, Hitler he needed to be stopped, is what many would argue. A legitimate authorities, not just anybody can start a war. The guys who have guns in their bunkers and are going to go, in Montana or whatever, they declare war on the United States might not be legitimate authorities, okay? So, and then use just means for this. With Augustine, the just means would be, there's some things that are just wrong. In our day and age, for instance, we have certain things just banned, chemical warfare, etc., and not, doing our best to not kill non-combatants. Say no chemical warfare, take care of prisoners of war, and protect non-combatants. So those are the criteria of a just war, and it seems to me they make the best case, which would mean then you have to decide what's a just war and whether you should be involved in it or not. And that is difficult, isn't it? If we were to look at the different wars, which the time is up, so we don't get to do that, I will typically ask, what about the first one, the Revolutionary War? Was that a just war? They were taxing us without representation. Kill them. I don't know. I'll let you think through that one, okay? And so we are.
So basically what you're asking, is it a just war if you antagonize the other country to the point where they attack you? So they can claim defense.
Okay, yeah. Was it defense? And to be fair, they were, could just walk in and say, hey, we're going to put our soldiers in your house and stuff. And so things weren't good. But was there another solution? I don't know. Canada never went to war, and they seem to be fine, independent at least. Although they still hold the king now as their king and stuff. I'm kind of glad he's not our king. I'm just kidding. Okay. All right. So you think about that and think about whether you want to. Now, it's difficult because what if you join the military and they get involved in an unjust war? What do you do? That's there's certain ways I think you can get around that. That one guy, Hacksaw Ridge, remember see that movie? Anybody ever see that? He was a complete pacifist, but he helped out in the war. So there's other ways besides killing people that you can help out and whatever. Okay. Anyway, we got to go. Sorry, and we're done. Elizabeth? Oh, I thought you were saying something. Nope. Okay, one more question.
Are we going to see you in the pulpit next week with a tattoo?
We already determined that it would be wrong for me to get a tattoo. An unjust war. All right, thank you all. We'll